After President Trump's impeachment trial ended in acquittal, he turns his focus to the 2020 election.
We are going to keep on fighting, and we are going to keep on winning, winning, winning.
But across the ocean, another leader under scrutiny ahead of a crucial vote. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, indicted on fraud, breach of trust, and bribery just months before a heavily contested national election, the third in under a year in that country. President Trump was impeached by the House on 2 counts, abuse of power and obstruction of Congress, after allegations that he asked a foreign leader to look into his political rival. Prime Minister Netanyahu is accused of intervening in regulatory decisions that favored certain media companies in exchange for positive coverage. Both leaders face potential removal from office with elections right around the corner. While Trump has been acquitted of his charges, Netanyahu still has a legal fight ahead of him. The two have used similar defenses, blaming the media.
The absolutely crazed lunatics, the Democrats, radical left, and their media partners standing right back there, are pushing the deranged impeachment witch hunt for doing nothing wrong.
The media court-martials us. They lie. They cheat.
Undermining the investigation.
I think that the whole impeachment thing, hoax, I guess you could call it, because it is a hoax.
התהליך המזוהם הזה, לא חיפשו את האמת. חיפשו אותי.
And claiming total and complete innocence.
We did nothing wrong. This is based on a perfect phone call.
לניסיון של הפיכה שלטונית נגד ראש ממשלה, בעלילות שווא ובתהליך חקירות מזוהם ומגמתי.
With two leaders consumed in legal trouble and both claiming complete innocence, what role do their attorneys general play in this process? United States Attorney General William Barr has defended President Trump even before the impeachment proceedings, including last April, after receiving the Mueller report.
The evidence developed by the special counsel is not sufficient to establish that the president committed an obstruction of justice offense.
But in Israel, after police recommended that Netanyahu be charged with bribery, Attorney General Avichai Mandelblit held a different kind of press conference. Mandelblit, a longtime Netanyahu loyalist who served as cabinet secretary prior to being attorney general, indicted the prime minister just months before a critical election. Let's back up for a second. There are important differences between the Israeli and the American governments and how the attorneys general fit into those systems. The Attorney General of the United States is nominated by the president and needs a vote of approval from the Senate. And while Israel's Attorney General is not appointed directly by the Prime Minister and instead by the Minister of Justice, Netanyahu backed Avichai Mandelblit for that position. Barr and Mandelblit became attorneys general with the support of their executives, which raises the age-old question: how can the Attorney General work independently? Now, some argue they can't. President Trump said he wouldn't even have hired former Attorney General Jeff Sessions if he'd known Sessions would recuse himself from the Russia probe.
Sessions should have never recused himself. And if he was going to recuse himself, he should have told me before he took the job, and I would have picked somebody else.
William Barr has certainly been criticized for his summary of the Mueller report, his expansive views on executive privilege, and his willingness to side with the president over American intelligence agencies.
I think our nation was turned on its head for 3 years. I think based on a completely bogus narrative that was largely fanned and hyped by an irresponsible press.
And even after the president's acquittal, Barr directed the Justice Department to receive information on Democratic rival Joe Biden and his son Hunter. Barr has challenged Trump occasionally, criticizing the president's tweets about federal investigations. But this hasn't stopped Barr from taking control of cases close to Trump, like when he recommended a less harsh prison sentence for former Trump campaign aide Roger Stone. Mandelbligt's critics argued that his long history with Netanyahu would be a conflict of interest when he was appointed Attorney General. That's a tougher argument now that Mandelblit has made Netanyahu Israel's first prime minister to be indicted, jeopardizing his own political future. President Trump's impeachment, while not the first, is only the third in U.S. history, establishing some precedent for William Barr. But Israel's Attorney General is in completely new territory. According to Mandelblit, Netanyahu does not have to resign. There is no law saying he must. If Bibi wins the next election, there could be lawsuits disputing that victory, extending an already year-long election and putting Mandelblit in the center of an unprecedented political crisis. So as the United States fixates on an upcoming election, Israel is stuck in a legal crisis with no end in sight.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.